and postdocs as well. Most people know him for his work in transport theory, but he's just spanned just about everything to do with phenomenology and modeling of heavy ion physics, including hydrodynamics, the initial state, and I think that his work on heavy flavor is really some of the very best in the field. And today he's going to talk about something different than everything I just mentioned. He's going to talk about how to use Bayesian analysis to infer properties of the quark-gluon plasma. So without saying anything more, the last thing I want to say is we should all congratulate Steffen. This year he was named Distinguished Professor of Physics at Duke, and that's all very well deserved. So Steffen, take it away.
Well, thank you, Scott, for the kind introduction. And I'm going to reflect it right back onto you, since the topic I'm going to be talking about today is something that Scott actually got me going on pretty much since the year 2000. That's when I heard Scott talking about these ideas for the first time. And it's been quite a journey. Let me first start out with a one-page introduction into, what my work is sort of all about. It's about probing the QGP and relativistic heavy ion collisions. You can see here a visualization done by Hannah Elfner, who is now a faculty member in Frankfurt. This is an actual calculation. You start out with an initial state, 2 colliding nuclei. These nuclei interpenetrate, a quark-gluon plasma forms. It expands, it cools down. There's one contour line missing here, but ultimately this quark-gluon plasma hadronizes, and then the hadrons rescatter before they stream into the detector. This all happens on a time scale of 10 to the negative 23 seconds. And there are distinct stages in this time evolution that require modeling and our attention, right? And this is even more so challenging because none of this can you measure directly in the experiment. Yes, so we established the connection between the quark-gluon plasma that we wish to probe and the particles that the detectors measure. We establish this connection by virtue of a transport calculation. Yes, by virtue of modeling these heavy ion collisions. And the most prominent stages that we have for that are the non-equilibrium early time dynamics, leading up to the formation of a quark-gluon plasma. This gets modeled in viscous fluid dynamics. And ultimately, at the time when fluid dynamics as a description breaks down, you make a transition to a hadronic transport kinetic theory to model the breakup phase of the reaction. And the principal challenges really are, from the experimental side, that the time scales of the collision process are too short to resolve, the length scales are too small to measure, and you have confinement, namely that quarks and gluons can only be observed as bound states and the experiments don't observe them directly. So computational models are really at the heart of what we need to connect these experiments to QGP properties. Okay. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about transport coefficients, in particular, the shear viscosity of the quark-gluon plasma. So shear and bulk viscosity, generally can be defined as the coefficients in the expansion of the stress tensor in terms of the velocity fields. And the shear viscosity is here, and the bulk viscosity is here. Yes, and U is the velocity field. Epsilon is energy density, and P is the pressure. All right. Now, there are many things these days that we can directly infer from lattice field theory, lattice QCD calculations. The shear viscosity or the specific shear viscosity, the shear viscosity over entropy density ratio is unfortunately not really one of them. There have been a few attempts to extract eta over S from lattice QCD calculations, but the errors are, of order 100%. Yes, because really it's an ill-defined problem for the lattice QCD calculations. Yes, so while the equation of state can be done nicely on the lattice, the transport coefficients really so far cannot. Okay, So the determination of the transport coefficients is one of our key goals. And unfortunately, lattice is not going to be able to give us a lot of guidance there. All right, so my interest in looking at the shear viscosity or the specific shear viscosity of the quark-gluon plasma can be traced back to one of the seminal papers in our field, I feel, and that's this paper by Chernai, Kapusta, and McLaren that in 2006, yes, that sort of laid out what the expectation was about the specific shear viscosity of the quark-gluon plasma. And what they did is they summarized in this big figure here what was known back then, and really it wasn't much. You could do calculations for a gas of pions or pions and kaons in the hadronic regime. You could do a hard thermal loop kind of calculation for the specific shear viscosity in the high temperature limit. Yes, this is a weakly coupled calculation. And you could see, right, so from the hadronic side, eta over S drops rapidly with temperature, and it rises again in the QGP side. And then you can contrast that to eta over S for other substances like helium or water. And you find that, there is a general feature that there is a minimum at the phase transition temperature, and whether or not the curve goes continuous through that phase transition temperature depends on the pressure. So there is no guarantee that the eta over S from one side will go smoothly to the eta over S on the other side. All right, fast forward about 14 years later, this is where we are today. Yes, and what I'm going to tell you about in this presentation is sort of the story on how we made this calculation that allowed us to generate a curve for the temperature dependence of the specific shear viscosity with quantified uncertainties. Yes, so this is more than a decade of hard work by multiple research groups. It speaks to a cooperation between theory and experiment and the statistical sciences, and it is a significant investment by the funding agencies that got us there. Yeah, okay. So it is also really a community-driven effort. Back in 2012, we had a financial crisis, at which point, we needed to formulate where would the RHIC heavy ion program go for the next decade? What would be its goals? And that all got then published in terms of a community white paper on the future of relativistic heavy ion physics at RHIC. And one of the goals that were laid out in that community white paper was that by 2022, we would want to have the temperature dependence of the specific shear and bulk viscosity, as well as relaxation times and other QGP transport coefficients. And what you see on the right-hand side is sort of a timeline that lays out the history from the early 2000s to 2012, when that white paper was written, and then a projection into the future of what we needed to do, both on the experimental side and on the theory side, in order to achieve those goals. And this timeline, actually, I would like to credit Björn Schenke for putting this together. He was part of that team that wrote that white paper. Okay, so I want to convince you for the rest of my talk that we are well on our way of delivering on that goal as it was laid out in that white paper. Okay, so how do we extract knowledge from relativistic heavy ion collisions? You take data, and the best data we get is from RHIC and LHC as examples, but non-exclusive. We have Alice and Star here and in my little cartoon. And these experiments have taken petabytes of data with many different measurements, observables at very high quality. Yes, as an example here, for the sake of inclusivity, I show you Atlas data. And on the right-hand side, you see that, we develop models for heavy ion collisions, and these models produce output that can be compared to that data. And by the comparison of model to data, we hope to extract the properties of the quark-gluon plasma that we do not access directly. Okay, here's a slide that I stole from Scott Pratt back in 2000, just to give you a scope of the time spans that are involved. And that shows what one of the biggest challenges is when we want to do that. A good computational model these days relies on dozens of parameters. You know, you have the equation of state, you have the transport coefficients, you need an initial state, you need to make assumptions about the dynamics prior to QGP formation and after QGP decay. Yes, and on the other end, you have tons of experimental data. You have yields, spectra as a function of centrality. You have elliptic flow, triangular flow. You have interferometric data. You may have correlation functions. Yes, and it turns out that, you know, this parameter sensitivity does not factorize. Yes, so every one of the model parameters can be dependent on multiple different observables. And that's a mess, right? I cannot just measure V2 and say that gives me my specific shear viscosity, and V3 gives me my initial state, and whatever the multiplicities give me my normalization constant for the hydro. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You know, there's multiple crosstalk between all these observables and many different parameters. Yes, so we have a large number of interconnected parameters. The data dependencies are not factorizable. We have correlated uncertainties. You know, nothing is measured to 100% precision. And our models are not 100% precise. Yes, they come with their own biases and uncertainties. So we are forced to develop novel optimization techniques based on Bayesian statistics and Markov chain Monte Carlo methods in order to tackle this problem. Yes, in particular, since transport models like the ones I alluded to really require too much CPU time in order to conduct such an analysis in a straightforward way. Fortunately, this kind of problem with complex computational models and large-scale data sets is not unique to relativistic heavy ion collisions. This is something that you find in cosmology, you find it in atmospheric studies, you find it across the whole range of the hard sciences. And so our colleagues from the statistical sciences actually have developed some very powerful tools that help us address these problems. Okay, so each computational model relies on a set of physics parameters to describe the dynamics and properties of the system. And these parameters really act as a representation of the information that we can extract when we compare model to data. Yes, so we have our model parameters, and in my case, you know, that will be initial state parameters, the viscosities, you know, other inherent model parameters. And it used to be in the old days, we would make a guesstimate for these parameters. We would put them into our physics model. We would calculate observables and then compare them to data. And then that was an iterative process. Yes, you know, if the comparison to data showed that we were somewhat off, then we would, you know, try to make an educated guess on how we have to tune our parameters in order to get better agreement. In a Bayesian analysis, you turn this arrow backwards. You know, you take all the data and you take what you know about your physics model to inform you in one wash about what the optimal set of parameters is, including the uncertainties. Yes, that's the power of this Bayesian analysis, that you don't do this anymore in this iterative approach, but you take a look holistically at all the data and the model and see which parameters work best. Yes, and so you can simultaneously calibrate all model parameters. You can determine these parameters such that they work best for your model, and you also get uncertainties associated with your parameters. Essentially, you get probability distributions for every single parameter, and that is very, very important. Okay. One example of a Bayesian analysis that everybody knows is for the detection of the gravitational waves by the LIGO Observatory. Yes, they too have a computational model for the collision or merger of two black holes or neutron stars. Yes, and by tuning the parameters of that model to the signal they get out of the LIGO detectors, they are then able to determine probability distributions for the masses of the two neutron stars, for example, or the black holes that are merging. Yes, so that was also done with the Bayesian analysis. All right, so how does a Bayesian analysis look like? What you see here is the scheme of a Bayesian analysis, and I'm going to walk you through all the individual components to show you how these come together. And I will start with the physics model. You know, what is the model that we put in for the time evolution of a heavy ion collision? That physics model is has three components really. The first one is for the initial state. We use a parametric initial condition model called Trento. Trento doesn't contain a lot of physics. It is more a mapping of the initial distributions of the nucleons in the nuclei onto an entropy density or energy density that you can generate when these two nuclei collide. Yes. Trento does not tell you how the system reaches equilibrium. This is something that is still, I would say, one of the most exciting topics in our field that we haven't fully figured out yet, is how do we go from the two coherent nuclei that collide to a quark-gluon plasma. But once we have that quark-gluon plasma, we know fairly well how to handle its time evolution. We use viscous fluid dynamics. In this case, I use event-by-event Vishnu, which was developed by the Ohio State group. That's the 2+1D viscous fluid dynamical code. It takes its equation of state from lattice field theory, and you can put in temperature-dependent specific shear and bulk viscosities. Okay, after the hydro has run its course, you have to convert the fluid cells into particles. And once you have done that, you can use a microscopic transport model, for example, URQMD, to run through the hadronic phase of the reaction. URQMD, or any kind of kinetic theory based on a Boltzmann equation, is well suited since it does not contain any equilibrium assumptions, so it can model the breakup of the collision. It has implicitly transport coefficients in there. You can extract them if you wish. For the sake of this analysis I'm going to talk about today, we're not going to do that. We're going to focus on the transport coefficients during the QGP evolution that are modeled by the fluid dynamical approach. Yes, and using the kinetic theory at the end is actually very nice, because that means that our analysis is not going to be contaminated much by the eta over S of the hadronic phase. All right, so what are the parameters of our calculation that we put into that framework of models, Trento plus hydro plus URQMD? So, and then these are the parameters that sort of are representing the physics that we can extract from our analysis. So one of the more technical parameters is, of course, the temperature at which we make the transition from fluid dynamics to the microscopic evolution. Then we have parameters for the initial condition. Trento has three main parameters that we need to calibrate on in order to determine the initial state of the reaction. We have a polynomial parameterization for the temperature dependence of the specific shear viscosity. One of the key assumptions that we have is that, and that is guided by the recoupling HDL calculations for the QGP, is that this parameterization is set up such that the specific shear viscosity in the QGP phase will be monotonically rising as a function of temperature, and that its minimum value will be at the transition temperature at TC. And then we have also some kind of parameterization for the specific bulk viscosity, and the sort of prior knowledge that we put in with this parameterization is that we have it peak also at the transition temperature. Yes, and there is some width and some magnitude, and yeah, I mean that's actually we may have done one experiment where we had the peak position sliding, but I'm not so sure about the calculation that I'm showing here, whether it had that feature. Okay, so what kind of data do we use? In this analysis that I'm going to show you here, we focused on LHC data, ALICE data at 2 beam energies and multiple centrality bins. Yes, we focused on fairly inclusive data. Yes, particle multiplicities, identified particle multiplicities, identified particle mean PTs as a function of centrality in both cases, then V2, V3, V4 as a function of centrality. And the reason we chose this set of observables is that they all had been measured with very, very small uncertainties. And also that our computational model would be able to calculate these observables with small uncertainties with a limited number of events. Yes, so 10,000 events per parameter set would be sufficient to calculate these with very small uncertainties. This would not have been the case, for example, if we had added the transverse momentum dependence of the elliptic flow into the mix, for which we would have needed a lot more events. Yes, and that costs CPU time, and CPU time is something that is challenging for these type of analysis. Okay, now we'll come to the core of the analysis, which is based on Bayesian concepts out of Bayesian statistics and Gaussian process emulators. That's a nifty little trick, and that I'll explain to you why we have used this and why this was crucial for us in actually making this analysis work. And so think about it. We have a model that has over a dozen parameters. Okay, so and we want to explore the parameter space. So we could do this brute force. We have 14 model parameters. We need to do calculations at 9 centrality bins. Let's say a precision for doing that is, if we have 20 bins per parameter, we know how this parameter behaves as a function, over its value range. Yes. So this means that if we want to explore a parameter space, we need to evaluate our model at 9 times 20 to the 14 points. Yes, if I just assume sort of a grid-like structure for my parameter space. Okay, now my initial conditions fluctuate, so I need not only one event per parameter set, I need about 10,000 events per parameter set. So that gets me to 10 to the 18 events. Now each of these events will roughly take 1 hour of CPU time, so I'm at 10 to the 18 CPU hours. That is 2 billion years of 100% use of the Titan supercomputer at Oak Ridge National Lab. Clearly, that's not feasible. And in the old days, when we sort of figured out how much effort such a parameter space study would take, then people would usually give up and say, well, it's not possible. Because then ultimately you have mapped out your parameter space, but you still don't know yet which point is the optimal point, right? So you still need to do a Markov chain Monte Carlo to figure out which is the point in parameter space that gives you optimal description of your data. So the moral here is, the lesson is that we need to find a trick that allows us to cut down the needed CPU by at least 10 orders of magnitude. It turns out that Gaussian process emulators deliver on that. Yes. So what is a Gaussian process emulator? It is a stochastic function that maps inputs to normally distributed outputs. It is specified by a mean and covariance function. It is a technique that comes from machine learning. So that's many people who do machine learning use these kind of process emulators. Yes. So they are very, very fast. So once you train them using machine learning techniques on actual model calculations, they allow you to interpolate between your model calculations in your parameter space. And they do this interpolation by including also a measure of uncertainty. So here the black dots are points at which I've really evaluated my physics model. And the lines represent, different manifestations of my Gaussian process emulator. And you can see that, yes, at the points where my physics model trained the emulator, they hit it exactly. but at the points in between, you know, they branch out. And the farther you're away from the training points, the bigger the uncertainty, the more these emulators can deviate from, you know, what the exact curve would be if we knew it. Okay. And so we still need to figure out, you know, how to sample our parameter space in order to train our Gaussian process emulators. Clearly, we want to sample at the fewest number of points possible, because each point costs us a lot of CPU time. And an algorithm that works very well for that is called the Latin hypercube. That's an algorithm that generates semi-randomized space-filling points in a volume. And it avoids large gaps in tight clusters. And it varies all parameters simultaneously. So it works very well if you have a high-dimensional parameter space. Turns out that in order to train your Gaussian process emulators, you need about 10 times the number, you need a number of points that is 10 times the number of parameters. Yes. So if I have 14 parameters, I could get away by just training about 140 points. By calculating my model at 140 points, training the Gaussian process emulators of that, and that would allow me to really probe the entire parameter space volume in probably a better precision than that fixed brute force grid that I talked about earlier. Yes, so 140 points versus, you know, what was it, 20 to the 14 points. Yes, so there you have your, you know, orders of magnitude in savings regarding the points at which you evaluate your computational model. So in this case, we were somewhat more conservative. We had 15 parameters, 9 centrality bins, 2 energies. So we did a Latin hypercube with 500 points at which we evaluated our computational model. That still meant that we needed about 35 million events. But 35 million is a doable number. Yes, and then we trained the Gaussian process emulators to interpolate between those. Okay, how do we get our 35 million events? Yes, we go to a supercomputing facility called NERSC. NERSC has a massively parallel computer with, you know, thousands of nodes, each of which has 24 cores, generates 2.5 petaflops per second. We developed a workflow that allowed us to run or to request 1,000 nodes per job. So we were running on 48,000 cores simultaneously. And our entire model design with about 30 million events, we ran in 1 day on NERSC. So we submitted 3 of these jobs. And for 1 day, we were the kings of the machine. So we go from 2 billion years to 1 day. 2 billion years, 1 day. So that's the power of Gaussian process emulators. All right, at the core of our analysis is Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem says that something called the posterior is proportional to the product of a likelihood and a prior. Yes. And so in layman's terms, the prior is any kind of initial knowledge that you can put in regarding the parameters that you wish to determine. The likelihood is nothing but the distance measure between the outcome of your model calculation and the experimental data. Yes, so think about it like almost like a norm, you know, where you have a vector from your, you know, the point, all the data that your model generates and the actual experimental data. Yes, how far away are these from each other? Okay, and the posterior will contain the probability distributions for every single parameter that we wish to determine. Yes, and we basically generate this posterior distribution by doing a Markov chain Monte Carlo. This is nothing but a random walk through our parameter space weighed by the posterior. And you know, you generate a large number of samples, and ultimately this converges onto this posterior distribution that gives us the probability distributions for the individual parameters. Yes, what we did is that we used something called the flat prior. So we did not make many assumptions on how our parameters behave within the design range. but we made the assumption that outside of the range, of the allowed range for the parameters, there was zero probability that the parameters would be there. Yes, and let me show you how this works in practice. Oh yes, I should also say that the likelihood function, that is this distance measure between the data generated by the model and the actual experimental data, yes, that contains, of course, both the uncertainties from the experiment, the error bars, and the systematic uncertainties, statistical error bars and systematic uncertainties that can be correlated. And it also contains our guesstimate of how uncertain our physics model is. Yes, so we estimated, for example, that our model would at best be able to describe the data on a 5% level. Yeah. Okay. So this is our prior, and this is a little bit sloppy way of saying this. What you see here are not bands. What you see here are individual lines, and each line stands for a calculation of our computational model using one of the 500 points of our Latin hypercube. So each of these colored bands is made up out of 500 lines, yes, which were the points in parameter space at which we actually calculated the physics model and then calculated the observables coming from there. And as you can see that, you know, those 500 points in our parameter space sort of blanket the vicinity of the data, but clearly, you know, now is the task to figure out, you know, which of these points or where in between is the optimum parameter set. So after we now do our training of the Gaussian process emulators and run our Markov chain Monte Carlo using the Gaussian process emulators, we come to this type of calibration. Now what you see here are, again, not bands, but lines, 500 lines in each case, but these are sampled from the posterior distribution. So these are samples from the probability distribution for all the parameters to show you now to what kind of uncertainty or certainty, you know, we are able to determine the value of these parameters and how well these work for the description of all the data that we have used. Okay. So what are the analysis results? And that's the key result of our analysis is really the posterior distribution. And that is an object that looks like this. Yes, so there is a huge amount of information in here. The diagonal are the probability distributions for every single parameter of our model. Yes, after it's been calibrated to best describe the data. And the off-diagonal elements are the pairwise correlations between these parameters. So what you would like to see are, of course, probability distributions that are sharply peaked, which means that, yes, you are able to constrain the parameter of your model in a nice way, and you get a good description of the data. Now, sometimes what you find is that you don't get a sharp peak, you get something that is rather flat. Yes. So what that means is that this parameter is really not well constrained, meaning that either your data is not sensitive to that parameter, or that parameter in your physics model really doesn't make that much sense. Yes. And sometimes you have probability distributions that sort of get cut off at the boundary. This could either mean that you did not choose your parameter range wisely, or, you know, in some cases, you know, it could also mean that you have biased your parameter range too much. Yeah, so for example, this parameter here is the probability distribution for the slope of the specific shear viscosity. And yes, you know, it peaks at a small positive number. So our shear viscosity is definitely is most likely rising. But you know, if you look at this cut here, you could argue, well, there should be a non-zero probability that the slope could also be negative. You know, that the shear viscosity goes down as a function of temperature. Yeah, so that would be sort of, you know, one of the lessons you could take from that kind of analysis. Okay, so what are some of the key highlights? I won't be able to discuss every single parameter in detail. The first one here is the switching temperature. That is the temperature at which we should switch from hydro to micro. And the switching, and this peaks at 152 MeV. That is very good news. First of all, the TC of the equation of state that we used was about 154 MeV. So we are peaking in the hadronic phase. That's good, that makes sense. We are peaking, pretty close to TC, which basically means that in the hadronic phase, probably equilibrium assumptions that go into, local equilibrium assumptions that go into hydro are not anymore justified. And that's also a valuable piece of information, that sort of the assumption of chemical equilibrium breaks down as soon as you hit the hadronic phase. I should note that if we redo our analysis and not calibrate on identified particle yields, but just on charged particle yields, then suddenly this peak vanishes and becomes flat, meaning that really hadron composition plays a major role in determining this peak, and just particle multiplicity integrated over different species does not do it. Okay. Then we have here a parameter that is one of the key parameters for our initial condition model Trento, and that parameter peaks very sharp at 0, and this is compatible or indicative of an eccentricity scaling that you would also see in physical initial condition models like IP Glasma and EQRT. Yes, and just as in contrast, if you would have an initial condition model based on KLN, then you would expect the Trento parameter to be at -0.6. And if you would have a simple wounded nucleon model, you would expect the Trento P parameter at 1.0, both of which are completely ruled out. Yes, based on this probability distribution. Then we have 3 parameters that govern the shape of our specific, of the temperature dependent of the specific shear viscosity. And we have likewise 3 parameters that govern the shape of our specific bulk viscosity, even though you can see here that the uncertainty bands are really, really large. And so we don't want to make strong statements about the specific bulk viscosity. Okay. So if you go into somewhat more detail, then you can see that there are some correlations among our parameters. Yes, there's an inverse correlation between the slope and the intercept. Yes, we don't have enough data to sort of independently pin down all these parameters, and we are most sensitive to temperatures below 230 MeV. We can understand that, given that our system lives longest in that temperature range and shows the biggest response, the conversion of spatial eccentricity into momentum space eccentricity that is being done by hydro, happens mostly in that, is dominated by that temperature range because the hydro lives the longest in that range. Yes, so if we go up to higher temperatures, then the uncertainties get larger and larger. And at some point, this is something we have found out recently, you get dominated more by your prior than by the data. Okay. Now,
Steffen,
yes.
There's a question. Can you address why the model misses the data more at higher PT, both for the prior and the posterior?
Higher PT. Where is PT? What do you mean with higher PT?
I think he's looking. It's.
Oh, you mean the mean PT of the protons? That?
Yeah, I believe so. But
yeah,
I don't know that that's really true. If I look at it, I don't know that that's really true.
Yes. So I'm not looking at any PT dependencies here because it would take me so much more, events to calculate that. Yes. So that's actually detail that we fixed in a subsequent analysis, and it has to do with the treatment of resonances. I think of the sigma resonance in our particularization model.
Okay. Yeah. And I don't see the really dependence on PT and how it misses.
No, I mean it's a mass effect, right?
More of a yield than anything else. Yeah.
Well, this is mean PT here, right? So
I'm sorry, that's a mean PT. Okay.
Yeah, mean PT.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, let me go back, sorry. So all the stuff I've talked about before, you know, probably the experts among you have seen many times. Now let me address something this is a complex analysis with a lot of moving parts, and people, you know, understandably may be skeptical about, well, does this really make sense, or is this just, you know, some voodoo science I'm doing here? And so there are a few things that we do in order to convince ourselves that we do this in a rigorous way. You know, and the first thing is validation. Yes, so we generate a separate Latin hypercube with 50 design points where we evaluate the full physics model, and now we compare that physics model output to that of previously conditioned emulators. So we really test whether our emulators do the right thing. And emulators are stochastic entities, right? So I mean, you would have, if everything falls on the diagonal lines, you know, observed versus predicted, then you would have 100% precision, and you don't expect that. You would expect to be close to the line, you know, in about 70% the cases, you know, you would have to fall within one standard deviation. And clearly our emulators perform, you know, really well. They perform better than that. Yes. Then you have verification. So once we have gotten the probability distributions for our parameters, we could take our parameters at the peak values, yes, and just put them in our physics model and do the calculation and see what comes out. And what comes out is that we are really able to describe all of the data within 10% accuracy. Yes, which you know, from my point of view, I think is a pretty good achievement. Okay. Then the next thing you can do is, of course, you can do predictions. You can now calculate observables that you did not calibrate on. Yes, here in this case, these are correlations between event by event fluctuations of flow harmonics. These take an insane number of events to calculate, right? So you would never want to calibrate on these because it would run your CPU expenditure sky high. But you can definitely calculate these after the fact and compare them to data. And, you know, it looks pretty good, I have to say. Yes, we're still statistics limited, but the trends are definitely all there in the right magnitudes. And then last but not least, you know, you have to do something which is called the closure test. Yes, you know, you need to verify that your analysis can recover true values for your parameters. And the way to do that is that you take your physics model, you put in some parameters for your, you know, so you put in some values for your parameters, and you generate fake data. Yes, and that fake data you then treat as experimental data that you run your analysis on. And if you're now able in your analysis to recover those parameters that you initially put in, then you know that your analysis is really working. Now, one of the things that, of course, make this more complicated is that by calculating observables, you are reducing information. Yes, so you would not expect to get your parameter values back with 100% accuracy, since you really reduce the amount of information that you're looking at. Yes. And but what you can see here in this comparison for, you know, various shear viscosities and bulk viscosities that we put in, yes, red are our input curves upon which we use to generate, you know, fake data. And then we did our analysis, and the blue bands are the outcome of the analysis. And what you can see is that this works for the specific shear viscosity remarkably well. For the bulk viscosity, if you take the uncertainty band seriously, it also works very well. But you can already see that the sharper peak the bulk viscosity has, the more our analysis struggles to recover that. Yes. And so what we learned was that the bulk analysis is more sensitive to the area under the bulk peak, but not the peak position, height, and width independently. Yeah, so these closure tests are important. You know, they teach you a lot about you know, how sensitive your analysis really is. And without the closure test, you have no idea whether what you extract really you know, is real. Yes, has any connection to the data that you're analyzing. Okay, so the next thing that we can do, of course, is we can expand our analysis. You know, we can go away from mid-rapidity, we can go to asymmetric collision systems, and we try to do that by introducing PA into the analysis. That, of course, required some modifications to our computational model, since the original Trento approach could not do PA. Yes, it did not contain subnucleon degrees of freedom that you need in order to do PA properly. So we introduced subnucleon degrees of freedom, and we try to do that without biasing us towards, you know, particular physics picture, right? So yes, you know, you could argue that in first approximation, your proton has 3 valence quarks. But then we know, of course, that, you know, depending on your scale, you know, you can resolve way more partons in your proton. And so what we came up with was a parameterization in Trento where we were varying sort of the nucleon radius. We were varying the number of constituents a nucleon has, and we were varying sort of the width of these constituents. Yeah, so these were additional parameters that we put into the analysis. And we now looked, for the sake of CPU time, we already looked at 1 beam energy, but we looked now at both proton lead and lead at 5 TeV. So this is the data set we looked at. And you can see that the calibration works well, even though the uncertainties, particularly for the proton nucleus case, are larger than for the nucleus case. So clearly we didn't have probably enough data to get our uncertainty bands really small. Now, what were the additional lessons that we learned from that calibration? You can see here, you know, one of the consequences, of course, is if you don't have that much data, then your posterior distributions get wider. Yes, we still, you know, the Trento, you know, eccentricity scaling parameter still, you know, peaks at 0 with high precision. That's the most solid result we have ever gotten out of our analysis, and we have done these analyses now at least 3 times. We have no strong preference for the number of constituents in a proton as long as the number is larger than 3. And there is some correlation between the constituent width and the sampling radius that we can establish. And yes, you know, ultimately we get something that is reminiscent of the size of a proton. Yes. Okay. So these are the results for the viscosities. And what we can see is that for the viscosities themselves, it makes more sense to add multiple different beam energies than it makes to focus on 1 beam energy and have multiple collision systems. So the analysis with only 1 beam energy and 2 collision systems had larger uncertainty bands for the viscosities than the analysis that only had 1 system but multiple energies. Yes, of course, you know, ideally you would just do both, right? Okay, I think I'm at the end of my presentation. Let me summarize. We have created a comprehensive set of computational models to describe the dynamic evolution of relativistic heavy ion collisions. We have developed a framework utilizing Bayesian statistics and high performance computing to execute a model to data calibration with uncertainty quantification. And we have applied these to the extraction of the specific shear viscosity of the quark-gluon plasma, which, as it turns out, is the lowest specific shear viscosity of any known substance that we know of. Yes, there are many ways that we can take this from here. You know, we can go to lower beam energies. Obviously, then, you know, your shear viscosity will become also mu-b dependent. We can include asymmetric collision systems beyond the 1 PA pilot study that we did. We can include hard probes. As Scott mentioned, our group has already done a dedicated study for the heavy quark transport coefficient using a Bayesian analysis, but that can be expanded too. And, you know, nothing in this analysis screams that you need to use Trento and Vishnu and your QMD, right? You know, if you have a physics model that you prefer, you know, it can be PHSD, or it can be music plus Smash, or, you know, whatever you want to do, right? You can do this analysis. Yes, nothing in this analysis depends on the specific physics model. So you can analyze any physics model you have in this way and gain valuable insights. And last but not least, I need to give credit to the many, many people who really made this work possible. Yes, there was, you know, people at Duke that with the kind of training they got, you know, became data scientists in all sorts of places. Yes, Jonah Bernard is now a senior data scientist at Lowe's. Scott Morland is a data scientist at IQVIA. Wai stayed and is at Berkeley. Ying Ru is a data scientist at Capital One. JF is still at Duke. Jay Coleman, one of our stats people, is now a quant with the LA Dodgers. Yes, you know, Jia Liu, who was one of the Vishnu developers, he's at SAP. So this has been actually, somewhat to my chagrin, you know, a springboard for many different careers in industry. But yes, so now all of these people mentioned here, in particular Scott, our chair, you know, without all the work they did, you know, this would have not been possible. Yes, this was a community effort, and it took us, you know, a decade to get it done. And my hope is, moving forward, that more and more people will continue to use these techniques and then play around with them, and that we will be able to gain more insight. And then for that purpose, you know, everything that we did, you know, is open source, and you can download the codes, you can play with them, you can use them. You know, for the most part, we have still people around who would be able to help if you have questions. But yes, you know, we are suffering from brain drain as well. But yes, go at it. And you know, I'll be happy for every other Bayesian, for every subsequent Bayesian analysis that I see out here. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Okay.